What is with all the unoriginal colonization? New Spain, New England, New Mexico, new names. How about that? You guys ever think about that? There's plenty of sounds and words out there. You can just make them up.
Welcome, everyone, to Unbelievable, the podcast where I, Luis, tell my good friend Kurt two unbelievable stories from history, one real, one fake.
And I have to guess which one's which.
That's right. I am human wrecking ball, Luis Mejia, joined by the proverbial bull in a proverbial china shop, Kurt Danner. And today, Kurt, it's my turn to try and fool you. We're back. We're back once again to this lovely space, this lovely podcast where I get to do my favorite thing, which is misinform. Are you ready, Kurt?
I am so ready. Sparks have been flying recently on this podcast because last episode I fooled you, and before that you fooled me, which that's 2 in a row. It's pretty wild. So anything could go down today. Watch out.
If we were living in the same city, Kurt, you'd be dead by now. But unfortunately, those urges I may have against your person, I cannot act upon other than this medium that is our podcast, Kurt. So with that in mind, I am ready to really bring out my best game, my A game even, and fool you for this episode of Unbelievable, Kurt. What do you think about that?
Big talk. Big talk. I'm ready. I'm so ready. We are going to get all our aggression out vicariously through misinformation. Smoke and mirrors.
Yes, and to start us off, Kurt, since I'm going to be taking the reins of this episode, please, do you have a fun fact for me today?
Ooh, I got a real fun fact for you today. Luis.
Is it fun, Kurt?
It's fun. You'll tell me if it's factual. How about that? Bada bing, bada boom.
Let's hear it.
You're ready. Look out. Watch out. Here I come. True or false, Luis? During a trip to Prohibition-era America, Winston Churchill got a doctor's note prescribing him a, quote, indefinite amount of alcohol.
Oh, yes, Kurt. I believe this is true.
It is. It is so true. I mean, that's a very Winston Churchill move. I actually have a little bit more interesting detail to tell you about this, Luis. If I could just interrupt your show for a little bit to give you a small little mini tangent here.
Please, Kurt.
This is 1932. Churchill is in the middle of this big tour across the U.S. giving speeches. In the middle of this, he's going to go meet a financier named Bernard Baruch on Manhattan's Upper East Side. And he calls a cab to get there, but he doesn't bring an address because he falsely believes that his friend, whoever this financial guy is well known enough that any New York cab driver would know his building. But the driver does not. So finally, Churchill has him pull over. He decides he's just going to walk to try to find it. He gets out of the cab, looks the wrong way because he's used to cars coming from the opposite direction, steps into the street, and gets hit by a car.
No.
In his words, he was, quote, squashed like a gooseberry.
Classic Winston.
Fractured ribs, fractured nose. He's got a pretty bad gash on his forehead, and he ends up spending 2 weeks in the hospital for this. Afterwards, he continues on kind of an amended version of the speech tour, and he has with him a doctor's note that he received that says, quote, "This is to certify the post-accident convalescence of the Honorable Winston S. Churchill necessitates the use of alcoholic spirits, especially at mealtimes. The quantity is naturally indefinite, but the minimum requirement would be 250 cubic centimeters. Signed, Otto C. Pickard, M.D."
Wow. I love the clarification of specifically at mealtime. They know what they're doing. Come on.
He's like, all hours, but make sure you got extra then.
Yeah, if it's at mealtime, it's best for his health, I promise. Oh, man.
So that's that, Luis. And
lovely.
You have told me that you've got some wild stories. You seem like you're ready to go, so I don't even want to talk about anything else. Just fire away.
Sounds good, Kurt. Well, in that case, with your permission, Kurt, I'm going to go ahead and start. And you know what? What better way to come back with an episode than to revisit, if you will, my old flame, my tradition, my favorite thing to talk about in this show, and that is Mexico, Kurt, my home country. We are back in the lovely land in the middle of the moon, Mexico. And this time, we're focusing specifically on the city of Mexico. Now, before I move on, Kurt, you know, and I've talked about this before in this podcast, I adore whenever a small action develops later on into a huge consequence. When the butterfly effect just works in the weirdest ways ever. We love this cause and effect. And luckily for us, these stories today will bring out some cause, some effects, and a whole lot of fun.
Ooh, boy. There is nothing better than a little domino, big domino story.
Both of these stories today will be just like that. As I mentioned, we're going to go to Mexico City, and I'm actually going to title these stories or give them a brief prelude so you see what we're going to come to eventually. Now, I'm going to give you the reason, in my honest opinion, the reason why Mexico has not developed as a strong world power as its nearest neighbors, Canada, the United States, have. Okay? And I'm going to give you the reason as to why. All right?
Okay.
Big talk today. Big talk today is what we're doing.
Big talk.
Yes. Now, I'm going to take you back to pre-Hispanic Mexico City. In this case, it's Mexico Tenochtitlan, right? The land of Tenoch, the capital of the Aztec Empire, what later would become Mexico City. Now, we've talked about Mexico Tenochtitlan back in the day. It's one of the wonders of the world. It seriously was one of the most wonderful metropolitan urban areas of the ancient world. Why is this? Well, they took advantage of their location. Okay, Mexico City, or Mexico Tenochtitlan, is a city that was founded in an island inside of a lake. And as it continued to grow, the city actually went into the water. So in a way, this city looks like a floating urban area, a floating city. Think of it as a Venice of the New World. And it's such a wonderful city. It's so big. A lot of people started living here that it became, probably at its peak, became the largest city in the entire world, Kurt. This is how impressive Tenochtitlan is. And as I mentioned, the city is not only on an island in the middle of a lake. It started expanding out onto the lake itself. How did the Aztecs do this? You've probably seen this. They developed agriculture. They developed these sort of... Exactly. They developed these big, essentially big pool floaties full of soil where they would plant their crops, and the water from the lake that the crops were planted on top of, that's how they got sustenance. It really is a marvel of hydraulic engineering at the time. It's fantastic. And not only that, but since the Aztecs were constantly involved with the lake water and were always surrounded by water, the Aztecs were just very wet constantly, okay? Like really constantly moist. Now, because of this, they even developed different systems to control the water. They developed a bunch of different dams, a bunch of different like openings in the lake so that they could control their crops, so that they didn't drown their crops every time the water rose or the rains came. So this city was essentially flood-proof, okay? Even though they were on a lake, they avoided flooding because of how good they were at dealing with water. It's incredible.
They were just like experts at living on an island in the middle of a lake.
Seriously.
Like, I don't know how they would have known this from the very start. Maybe there was some trial and error in the beginning that got lost because it wasn't written down. But it does seem like they just like discovered the how-to manual for how to live on an island in a lake and then followed it exactly. Seriously.
And it's, again, really incredible, too, because that allowed them to even build big roads, like main avenues that would lead from the island nation to the mainland. So they were always connected. So it really is wonderful. They even had some system to pump water out from very specific places. Seriously, this place was a wonderful architectural marvel. It's hard to express. They got it going on. Just right here. It's hard to express just how much I would love to see this city like Tenochtitlan in its glory.
I know. Me too now.
If you told me right now, here's a time machine and I'm going to send you back somewhere, wherever you want for a week, where would you like to go? I don't know, Mexico City in January of 1519. Literally, that would be the best.
You're like, air conditioning who? I want to see these floating gardens.
Exactly. I want to see the aqueducts. I want to see the floating gardens. Unfortunately, if I were to be transported in 1519, January of 1519, it's unfortunate for me because a couple months later, around 4 months later, the Spanish arrived. Bwah, bwah.
Wah, wah. Boo. Oh, boo.
Yes, the Spanish get here, and as they do, as colonizing typically does, they ruin everything, you know?
Yeah.
And, you know, I don't know if you're aware that the Spanish arrived in Mexico, but they did in 1519 in April. And it was not great for the people living here at the time. I'm not going to go in full depth as to all the atrocities and all the different conquering that went down in Mexico when the arrival of the Spanish. But, as we know, a lot of people died, a lot of heritage was lost, et cetera, et cetera. It's a story we've heard all the time that I'm not going to spend time in going through. However, I'm going to tell you the funniest way that they messed up. Seriously.
Okay.
The funniest way that they absolutely did something wrong. And that's the focus of this story right now. So with all that context, let's get started. The Spanish were adamant on building a new Spain in Mexico, or at least in the New World. That's why they named this entire part of the world New Spain. That's the name of the empire on this side of the world.
What is with all the unoriginal colonization? New Spain, New England, New Mexico, new names. How about that? You guys ever think about that? There's plenty of sounds and words out there. You can just make them up.
Because all words, as we know, Kurt, are made up. So
all
they
words
could have
are
just made up another one.
Anyway, that was my little rant. Sorry, continue.
But unfortunately, as the Spanish were not creative, they named it New Spain. And their crown jewel, the crown jewel of their entire new colony was going to be Tenochtitlan, which they started naming Mexico City. This was going to be not just the capital of what would then become Mexico, but it would become the capital of all of New Spain. So from Mexico all the way down to Argentina, that would be the capital of the New World. Wow. And so the Spain went ahead to make a more beautiful, a more organized Madrid, basically. That's what they wanted with Tenochtitlan. So they planned out the city. They planned out what this place would look like. As usual, they established a grid system, which was already kind of in place in Mexico Tenochtitlan at this time. They paved the streets and they started growing the city outwards. The classic Spanish colonial architecture, which means there's a central plaza, there's a central spot, and everything goes from there. Okay.
Oh, that's good. I thought you were going to tell me they just added some suburbs around the lakeshore on the outside because you were like, they started growing the city out. And I was like, oh no, urban sprawl.
Oh, Curtis, baby, you're getting ahead of yourself as you want to do in this podcast.
Let me sit in silence.
Now, the city starts to grow outwards, and as they're doing that, you can throw some churches at it. While you're at it, throw some churches onto the city. I don't know, if maybe mess around, establish a caste system. Classic standard Spanish colonization. It really is a marvel. They start growing a whole new city. They start expanding out onto the floating gardens, opting instead to get rid of the agriculture that was a central key of Mexico Tenochtitlan, and start building housing on top of those structures, which already a bad sign. They're like, okay, we're going to outsource our crops. And in order to continue growing, they said, okay, we can continue growing out into the city. However, something's blocking our path. What is that something, Kurt? It's the dams.
Okay. I just feel like they're not thinking this through. Okay, so the dams are blocking the path to get more land, but when we remove the dam, aren't we going to lose land somewhere? I mean, it's not like it's just like a tree that's in the way. It's made for a reason structurally.
Well, Kurt, you hit a critical nail in the coffin, meaning that just by asking that question, you have asked more questions than the Spanish did at that time.
Uh-oh.
All right.
Uh-oh.
Now,
let me tell you something. All the plundering the Spanish did, the one thing they evidently did not get was the how to build a city on the middle of an island in a lake book. That one they couldn't get their hands on, apparently.
Well, in a way, I think the Spanish were fully critical of the native Mexicas of the time, essentially saying, they're not going to build a good system here. They are not civilized. How could they build a city in a lake? They must be dumb, is the thinking of the Spanish, which is the one thing. Frankly, in my opinion, this is the critical move that would alter Mexican history forever, Kurt.
Wow.
And I'll explain to you why. So, getting rid of the dams, as you pointed out, is a little obvious. You can't control the water, so you're basically at the mercy of the gods to avoid flooding.
Which the Spanish have not been very nice to since they showed up, by the way. I mean, if you're saying gods plural.
Not to the gods.
Not to the gods plural. They have not been real great to, no.
They really care about their one god, and that one god doesn't really care about rain or flooding. Actually, he loves flooding, if I recall this story correctly. So
Historically,
that one god loves flooding, but so that's what he does. Flooding becomes a constant thing in the new Mexico City. Now, the crops that were growing around the city used to suck up a lot of the water. They acted as a sort of natural barrier, right? So if the city still flooded, if there was a lot of water that came in, the crops would act as a bit of a cushion, or in a way sandbag the approach of the water. Sure, the damage would be a little slower and some of the crops would die. They would be naturally drowned. But that, again, was a natural barrier. So if you fully get rid of the crops in order to build more housing, your first line of defense against flooding is the housing itself.
Yeah, I was thinking that, actually. I just realized earlier when you said that they built housing there, I was like, because something in the back of my rural brain was like, water saturation. That's not good.
Yeah, never good. So the Spanish, again, refused to think ahead in that regard. Now, here's a really interesting problem that was formed with the growing of this new city. What are Europeans used to at this point? Paved streets, okay?
Right.
Which is not something that was huge in this part of the world at the time. So if you pave your streets, the water has nowhere to go. It doesn't get reabsorbed into the ground. You have paved streets.
Water saturation, what am I saying? Come on, guys.
Right. The water is just going to flow. So here's the Spanish not only introduced smallpox into the New World, but now they've also introduced water runoff. Seriously, a crazy concept to include in your new colony. They say, hey, these people have never experienced runoff. Let's give it to them.
In a big way.
So, yes, runoff is now a thing in the New World, Kurt, which is, frankly, sad.
Yeah, this is terrible, because I also picturing just like that they paved the roads and a lot of the greenery is gone, and now it's just getting more densely populated. It feels like, you were saying that it was like the Venice of Mexico. Imagine if like they destroyed all of Venice and just built like a plain American suburb there. Like, I feel like that's what just happened to Tenochtitlan.
Yeah, the only thing missing right now from this Hispanicization of Tenochtitlan is just like a Costco somewhere.
Yeah, they got whacked over the head with gentrification in a big way.
Seriously. But, regardless of this, the city kept growing. Again, since it was the capital, the Spanish were adamant in that this was going to be the capital. Floods every year became more and more intense. They became more and more destructive, not only because you have more people to impact, but there's less space for the water to go.
Right. And once you have floods, it would be like self-perpetuating, because what crop fields or actual soil you do have would get like washed away, and then that's less protection for the next time it floods.
Truly. And now, so they have to come up with other solutions. Are they going to put up a dam? No, of course not, because that means that they have to limit their size of the city, like the pre-Hispanic people had been doing for forever. And they said, no, none of that. This is a fertile land, so we're going to keep growing. What are we going to do? We're going to add drainage and pumping systems in order to lower the water level of Lake Texcoco, which is the lake that Mexico City stands on. Okay, so this is their solution. They started essentially little by little draining the lake so that floods were not as intense. This did solve a problem to an extent, but at the expense that Mexico City doesn't have any water anymore. Absolutely no water, like fresh water for its citizens to drink.
Right.
Within the city itself. Yet, still floods. Don't worry, Kurt. The flooding is still happening. It's just happening less, but still going on.
Oh, great.
Now, this naturally caused a lot of lasting problems in the capital of New Spain. Flooding, which used to be a rarity in the time of the Aztec Empire, became a regular yearly event that would alter life inside of Mexico City. About 4 months out of the year were completely unusable for, I don't know, around 200 years. So,
oh, wow.
And this essentially continued the problem of urbanization. Why? Because if your city is growing, where are you going to go? Somewhere outside the city.
Right.
And so the city will continue to grow farther and farther away from where the flooding will happen.
Right.
And so now you have this big city that's flooding constantly, and the city is just growing. Okay, so now this lake bed is being covered more and more by housing, to the point where it's almost, the lake is basically disappearing year after year. This also created some sort of class division, because people, typically rich people, often had what are called, quote, flood houses, unquote. These would be outside the city. There would be big mansions, so that during the flood months, they could continue life without really being affected by the flooding.
Wow.
So they would essentially
that's fancy.
travel. Really
Yeah.
is. They essentially developed suburbs to escape the flooding.
Well,
So
it's like a
they would live.
seasonal home, you know. It's like how people would have their summer home, but they're like, we have our flood home.
Yeah, exactly. That you hit the nail right on the head, Kurt, because they would leave the city essentially to the suburbs. And typically at this point, the rich people had haciendas, which were essentially plantations. So you would have all your servants and you would have your businesses. So these businesses never had to stop for 4 months like other businesses, right?
I'm guessing that since all the rich people now are not really that affected by the 4 months of flooding, that it's getting lots of attention to fixing that problem, I'm sure.
Certainly. Of course, Kurt. Why fix a problem when you can just run away from it, you know? Classic.
Yeah.
Classic
Well,
move.
also I think probably in the minds of some people, once it's not a problem for the rich people anymore, that is problem solved.
Seriously. And now that you mentioned that, we can talk about the poor people that lived in the city of Mexico.
Who are just swimming away. They're just treading water so hard.
Their legs are so strong, Kurt.
Calves burning.
4 months out of the year, their legs don't stop moving. Now, the poor people in the city had two options. You either hunker down in the city and figure out what you're going to do, try to survive the flooding to the best of your ability and take advantage of it, maybe with fishing or I don't know, try to figure out some other ways of getting around it.
Not that they should have to be in that position, but you love to see the resourcefulness.
Seriously, I mean, we're hard, resilient people.
Yes,
Mexicans are.
yes.
We've always been. And the other option was to become some sort of environmental refugees, right? So you leave the city to the suburbs to populate the suburbs because you can't live in the city you grew up in, and thus the city continues to grow. The urbanization continues to extend past the original borders of the city, getting closer and closer to what we now think of to be Mexico City. This huge urban sprawl, probably one of the largest in the world, because people wanted to get away from the center of Mexico. And the city continued to grow. And what does this mean? Flooding kept happening because you're still building your city on a lake bed, and potentially worse than before because, again, water has nowhere to go. The only problem or the only solution, again, was the complete full disappearance of Lake Texcoco.
It feels like they got caught on fire and they're trying to run to put it out.
Yeah, essentially. Because what's going to put out the fire, Kurt? Flooding.
Oh, yeah, that too.
Yeah, think about that. So now this had some lasting problems. Like we mentioned, this class division. Farmers and poor workers sometimes really couldn't afford leaving the city
Right.
because most of their things disappeared year after year. So the rich kept getting richer. The poorer lost their things yearly,
Classic.
something like that. So this still happens now. The class division was so intense that this is one of the main reasons why the Mexican Revolution happened in 1910, is that the problems that could have been solved with the years of the government helping out and stuff like that really didn't came to pass because of flooding. Okay.
Wow.
And just as a additional fun fact, all the people in power in Mexico City live in high places, not just figuratively, but literally.
Yeah.
The big palace in the center of Mexico where the government works has about 4 to 5 floors. That's on purpose. In case it floods, they can flood the full first floor, and the city continues to have to run its organization. Wow. Not only that, for a long time, they built at the point it was a fortress, and then it became the presidential palace or the viceroyal palace. The viceroy would live it, and they built it in a hill called El Cerro de Chapultepec. It's literally a castle on top of a hill where you could live in all your luxury, not having to worry about flooding. Right. So that's really interesting that you have this literal high and low because poor people lived in literal valleys or kind of chunks of the city that would flood often. It's this complete physical division as well. Now, as we talked, Lake Texcoco is being pumped out. All the water is getting drained so that it's not affecting Mexico anymore.
Right.
That water, though, has to go somewhere.
Right.
Right. It doesn't. Nothing it has to go.
They're
somewhere.
bad at this water thing. They don't understand.
It's like the Spanish had no idea what water was until they came to the.
I know.
Seriously. all this water went outside the city. That's why some nearby cities started growing. Some cities that are closer to the mountains, like for example, Guanajuato, a bunch of cities instead there like León, San Miguel, those started growing mostly because they had access to the water. Some rivers that crossed through there became so powerful that water barons essentially came out from the woodwork. It's like Mad Max. People in power are the people that have control of the water, which is the most dystopian thing, but this happened 200 years ago.
Mad Max,
right?
But if it was in the orange Mexico filter.
Exactly. It's Mad Max, but everyone's just, it's not high race cars. It's just a very tuned up, like, Toyota.
I thought you were going to say wagon pulled by a donkey.
All right, Kurt, I was not ready to go into stereotypes just yet, but I'm glad you brought it up.
You said Toyota.
Sorry, Nissan. Is that better, Kurt? I don't know. All right. Now, Mexico City is the biggest city in the entirety of New Spain and in the entirety of the Americas at this point. Right. And it has no way to get water from within. It has to get water from outside of Mexico.
Insane.
It's whack. It's one of the, and that extends to this day. Like right now, Mexico doesn't get its water from itself. It has to go other places in the country to give water to the millions upon millions of people that live in that city. It's insane.
You know the Office quote where Dwight is saying that he can raise or lower his cholesterol at will, and Jim is like, "Why would you want to raise your cholesterol?" And he's like, "So I can lower it again." The Spanish are like, "We got to pump the water out of the city, so then we can pump it back in, so we can pump it back out again, and then have it shipped in." It makes perfect sense.
Yeah, and of course, this only benefits the high society, the people that are taking advantage. It's a story that's been played out all the time. Yeah. Now, we're going to very quickly pivot. We're coming towards the end of the story. We're going to pivot. Now, Mexico has never won an armed conflict. Okay?
Okay.
Sure. There have been plenty of conflicts, like a lot. Foreign interventions, wars with other countries, a lot of civil wars, which, do you really win a civil war if you're winning against yourself?
It's a tough call for sure.
It's a tough call. So just to be clear, Mexico never has won an armed conflict, which, you know what, in a way.
Never yet, Luis. They still got it. I believe in Mexico.
Kurt, I don't know. I'm kind of proud of the losing streak. I don't know about you. I think it's a point of pride.
Well, Luis, maybe I think you wear it well.
Thank you, Kurt. That means a lot.
Maybe that's
more than you think. And the only conflicts that we have won, it's been conflicts that we've won because we were part of the winning team, aka World War II.
You have to understand that even if you lose, it doesn't matter because the after party is gonna go hard till 5 a.m. either way. That's what it is. We've lost every armed conflict. Who cares? Afterwards, pour tequila.
Exactly. Again, very resilient people we are. We say we may lose, but we're still celebrating, right? Now, and you may wonder, Mexico is a huge country. It's about half the size of the U.S., and it has tons of natural resources. It's got lumber, it's got oil, it's got 2 oceans that it's connected to, it's got mountains, it's got mines. Why has Mexico not advanced in the same way that the US and Canada have for the last 300 years? That's the question I posed at the beginning of this podcast was.
The water.
I would argue it's the war, because we've been invaded, or Mexico has been invaded by countless powers. It got invaded by the French twice. It got invaded by the Americans twice. It got invaded by a bunch of different places. We've just been constantly fighting, which doesn't allow the country to grow.
Right.
And one of the critical reasons why every single time there's a war where Mexico is involved, we lose, it's because foreign invaders or any person we're going against has a really easy way to win the war, which is cut off the water supply.
Don't say that on the podcast, Luis. Now everyone knows.
No, Kurt.
Anyone can invade Mexico now.
Anyone could invade Mexico before, Kurt, as if this podcast was stopping them. Okay. Hell, I could invade Mexico, and I live here. Now, a quick fact: there's a big river in Mexico, the largest internal river in Mexico. It's called the Lerma River, and that's what feeds Mexico City's water. Again, longest internal river in Mexico. So it crosses through a bunch of different states. But it's one river,
Right.
Kurt.
Right.
If you block supply to this river, all of Mexico City is without water.
Wow.
The entirety of the city.
The former city built on a lake.
Exactly. The former city built on a lake depends on a single river to feed its millions of people.
Wow.
Right? So every single war, without fail, the first thing that people do or that our foreign invaders do is get control of the water.
Yeah, of course.
And it fails so quickly. And all of this because of the Spanish's inability to realize that dams were important and because of the greed of building a big city. So now we have the biggest city in the world, or one of the biggest cities in the world, and it's so vulnerable to the point where Mexico has not been able to advance culturally, scientifically, as some other countries around the world.
Wow.
And I just find that to be stellar.
Yeah, it's super interesting to me to think about it in like the way that water and access to water affects the development of civilizations, because there is like a definite pattern of, you know, all the major world civilizations develop normally with access to water or like it's supplying fertile land. So that is like a really interesting point to make, that we don't really think of, even in modern times, how much of a hindrance lack of access to water can be. I mean, definitely like, you know, just for person to person, but like as a society, how much it can weigh you down.
Seriously. And one of the extra facts I'm going to throw in at the end of this story is that, for example, all of this water that came out of Lake Texcoco went to other places in Mexico. And now other places had a lot of water. Who took advantage of these? I don't know. The Germans who arrived and said, we can make a lot of beer here because of all of this water. So the biggest beer processing plants are in Mexico, but not in Mexico City because Mexico City has no water.
Interesting.
And actually right now, Mexico is the largest exporter of beer in the world.
Wow.
And it's funny that its capital has no water. And one last thing, Kurt, which is going to blow your mind, I hope.
Okay.
I'm sure you're aware, and I apologize for this term in the podcast, but we're probably aware of the slur that the U.S. Americans use to Mexicans that have crossed the border illegally to the U.S. That is wetback. That in Spanish, in Mexican Spanish, we have a way to say wetback. We essentially just say mojado, which means wet, right? That's what we call immigrants that cross illegally to the United States. Now, this term could be originated, the term mojado, from crossing the Rio Grande. So you'd have to swim, and thus your back is wet, you know, or you're just a wet person who's crossing. However, this term originated in the mid-1800s to refer to those poor farmers and the poor people of Mexico City that used to live in the, quote, wet areas of Mexico City that had to leave central Mexico as, again, these environmental refugees to go to the suburbs.
Wow.
So it's still relating to migration, but internal migration. And that's where the term mojado comes from.
Wow. That is incredible. Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of like, I don't know if it's like necessarily a history repeats itself, but it is interesting, you know, just for words and phrases in general that are longstanding, how sometimes they come from one meaning and then they exist for so long that people assume they're from another meaning because they've just been around for that long. Yeah, it's super interesting. But yeah, that's a really, I mean, it's a cool story. It's like a really depressing story too, for sure. But
it's incredibly sad.
More than anything, for me, it's just interesting at both ends, because I also knew that Tenochtitlan was a really amazing city, but not quite to the extent that you described. And you're really passionate about it, so hearing you describe it was really interesting, because it made me feel like I had a better picture of it visually. And then it was just like depressing bad city infrastructure all the way through until we got to the end, and I was like, wow, water does have a big impact. But
it does.
The constant theme was we did have a lot of water. We had water in good ways, and then we had water in bad ways once the Spanish showed up.
We used to be a real country with nothing but water.
So yeah, I definitely feel like the Spanish did not ask some very basic questions that probably would have benefited them. But I think I can shortcut this whole process. If we had it to do all over, okay, everybody's happy, everybody wins. You ready for this, Luis?
Yeah.
Put the whole city on floaties. Everything floats. If it floods, you just raise. That's your new ground level. Otherwise, you're just sitting there. Done deal. Who put the water there? Put it there. put it under the road, put it on top of the city. We don't care. We're floaty boys.
When I become a federal politician here in Mexico, Kurt, that's going to be my tagline. Bring water back to Mexico City. Flood the city.
Yeah, now it's a 2-step plan. Now you first you have to get everything on floaties, and then you have to bring all the water back.
Now you have to bring all the water back. Yeah, Kurt, you're missing the very intense step. And Mexico is very high above sea level, so it's going to be an issue.
Okay, actually, Luis, I've seen the light. Okay, ready? The vision has come to me. All right. Step 1, you're elected president. Okay. Step 2, annex all of Central America down to Panama. Step 3,
right.
Put the entire continent on floaties, and then you just separated the Panama Canal and the Rio Grande. Mexico is now mobile. We're taking this show on the road, baby.
It's going to be the next cruise attraction.
Yes. Well, and also I should say, because I don't want to just, throw the annexation of all of Central America in there too blindly, that I guess it'd be like extended Mexico is on the road now. Mexismo.
Yeah.
Mexismo? Is there anything there? I don't know.
All right. I understand the passion
of
the project.
I tried. I did what I could. I also want to say another thing about this story really quick. This is really interesting to me because I know just like a little bit that there's long been a belief that the reason why there was not the same development in places like in Africa or in the Americas as there was in Europe is because of the terrain or the infighting, or basically that there was something about the environment or the societies that kept them in like more tribal living until the colonizers showed up. And I know that in recent years, a lot of people have pushed back against that and offered several other explanations. One being that there were those cities. It's just they weren't discovered by Europeans, so it was assumed that they didn't exist. But also another really interesting one is that, like, hey, maybe if people hadn't showed up and destroyed their waterways and plundered everything, they would have been doing a little bit better off.
Yeah.
But, I'll say this, whether this story is true or not, I think that's a really important thing, just because it's, like I said, until recently, I think it's been something that a lot of people have believed because it's like on paper, it seems like it might be kind of convincing or there might be kind of some logic to it. But it seems very clear that like things like water and colonization played a much larger role than the environment or the societies.
You heard it here first, folks. Kurt Danner is against colonization.
Yeah, okay. I mean, hot take. You're really going to have to hold my feet to the fire to own up to that one later. Okay, you got me. I booed the Spanish earlier when they showed up in the Americas. What do you want from me, Luis?
We just got to make sure. I just needed you to say it. I was recording
record?
this whole time, Kurt.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, Kurt. Well, with that, I think it's time for our next story.
Yes, please tell me. What's our next little domino?
So, Kurt, you mentioned that story was unfortunately a little sad. It ended up in a melancholic term with real issues that have brought on real problems to the real world of today. And I'm afraid that this next story is no different, Kurt.
What are you gonna do? That's always going on. Come on.
At the end of the day, we like to be optimists, but the world sucks. And you know what? Here we are making a podcast about it.
Newsflash, guys. History. Not great, mostly.
Yeah, seriously.
Not a fun time for the most part.
Yeah, researching for this podcast typically has me in tears. It's kind of fun.
Yeah. Anyway, that being said, bring us even further down, I guess, Luis. We started on a low note. Let's go deeper. You guys like this podcast? Is it fun to listen to this?
Because I can guarantee it's not fun for us.
Just so you guys know, whatever you answer, we're not going to stop. It won't have any effect on us, but just curious. Right. Anyway, that being said, go ahead, Luis.
All right, Kurt. So we're going to go to Europe, particularly London, in 1811. All right?
Good year.
It's a great year. Mostly because that's a year after the Mexican War for Independence started, so there's something to look forward to. But
are they going to win it?
Unclear. I don't want to let you know. Now, here's what happens. There's a man, an inventor, called Philippe de Girard. De Girard. It's a Frenchman. A Frenchman who really, at this point, not really known to history. But this man is very important, Kurt, and I can tell you exactly why. He developed an idea. He developed an invention to put food inside of a
microwave
metal can. Inside of a metal can, and then put that can on a fire for around 6 hours. All right,
okay.
Kurt? And he found out that doing this process, you can keep food for way longer than before. So this man essentially invented canning.
Oh.
Okay. And canned foods. If you're English, tinned foods. Now, this man, very important development, right?
Right. Super major, actually.
It's a really, really big development. Now, Philippe de Girard initially had the idea of selling this patent of this new canned food to France. However, the system in place of the patents in France was a little different than it is now. In France, if someone had a good idea, they went to the Académie Française, which is the French Academy, the French Science Institute, and if the French government thought it was a good idea, they would pay you for it. Okay? So
they had like Shark Tank like way before it was cool.
Basically,
Exactly.
You'd have to go pitch your idea to the Académie Française.
The weird part is Mark Cuban was still there and like the same age too.
Just French.
Just French, yeah. Mark Cuban.
So Mark Cuban.
Cut this out later, Luis. Please don't do us like that.
If I'm not known for anything, Kurt, the only thing I'd be known for is just my ability to mispronounce French. Now, the reason, or this meant that Girard went to the Académie Française, and they didn't really think that canning was great.
They were not wild about canning.
They saw this and they said, "Okay, you made food hot inside of a metal can. Cool, man. Awesome."
They're making some valid points.
Yeah, well, at this point, you're like, okay, that's kind of dumb. They couldn't see the potential. But think of yourself as the Académie Française. You'd see this man. He's like, okay, you see these beets? Stick them in a can. Put them in a fire. 6 hours. Open it. You got beets.
Well, he's got to show them that it stays fresh. He's just got to be like, wait for it for like 6 months or whatever, and then open. Boom, fresh.
I'll come back.
Okay, yeah.
Girard, because of this, he went to London. He decided to go to London because in England, the philosophy there was more entrepreneurial, right? Kind of how it is now. Mm-hmm. There was capital involved. So you were prepared to take a risk with this patent, get some money, and then hopefully spread your idea around, and hopefully you make money from it, okay?
Right.
Now, that's why he went to London, and it really caught on. This is how he patented this food, and this is how the canning of meats and the canning of food became standard in 1800s Europe. Like you mentioned, Kurt, this was huge. Mm-hmm. This was incredibly popular because now food preservation is a simple thing that everyone can do.
Right. Especially for like transportation, or if you consider the amount of people who are traveling by boat who need to take food with them. There's a lot of cases where people would like to be able to keep food long term, but there's, not really any form of refrigeration, especially not accessible to the common person. And
you're actually on the right boat, Kurt. This canning technique was very popular with the Royal Navy. Okay? The Royal Navy, at this point, Britain is probably the leading power, the leading sea power in all of Europe, in all of the world, really. Since the invention of long ship rides, since the invention of the Navy or riding by boat long distances, the only food that you could eat was cured meats, like salted meats,
right,
or bread. Like bad bread, even like hardtack, like these biscuits that are really tough so that they don't grow moldy. Right. That's the only food you could really eat on ships. So the biggest killer of seamen, of naval officers, was not necessarily battles or dying at sea or disease. It was rather malnutrition. Mm-hmm. Okay, and you can see this with, for example, scurvy being considered one of the Navy-related illnesses. Scurvy is just a lack of vitamins, and that's why you would see a bunch of people traveling with oranges, or famously the English would travel with carts of limes to avoid scurvy. That's why they're called limeys. That's a whole issue.
Right.
Now that canning was invented in the early part of the 1800s, you could put more food in ships, and better food, better nutrition, to the point where you could have your seamen not die. Okay? Right. Like your sailors are not dying, which is a big plus. And secondly, you can go on longer trips without having to resupply.
Right. Yeah.
And because And because Britain or England had the patent at the time, they were the only ones to be able to do this.
They're not sharing.
So,
they're like cans only for us.
Yes, Kurt, because why would you? If you have this incredible technological advantage over literally the rest of the world, why are you going to share it with the world, at least until further advances?
Well, are they like selling it to the rest of the world, or are they just like nobody gets the cans but us?
Oh, they're selling it, of course. But
okay. I can see them not sharing the process, especially after France passed on it. That's what they get. Okay, England's not going to let up on France, that's for sure.
Right, but the important thing here, Kurt, is that Britain, who was the leading naval power at the time, becomes even more powerful. Right?
Yes,
and that's a huge.
All hail the almighty can. The almighty canned beat.
Yes, the canned beat will rule the seas. Now, what happens from here is people start taking more and more risky trips around the world. They're traveling more onto the New World. They're trying to take advantage and exploit some of the New World. This is when famously some of the explorations by Darwin and other scientific explorations are happening. And more famously, this is when the Pacific starts getting explored by European and American explorers.
Right.
Okay. At this point, we have in our story people that go to Brazil, for example, and they get a bunch of different seeds, and they're traveling around with seeds and seeing where else they can plant these seeds. Okay. So this is big. They go to Brazil, and what's big in Brazil? Rubber trees. Right. That's very exciting. So some people they're like, okay, hold on. I can grab these seeds and I can travel all the way to, I don't know, the Philippines, to Sri Lanka. I can go to all these different places and try to plant rubber trees. So weirdly, there was a huge explosion of rubber trees around the world because of this. Rubber was not just a South African or even South American or Mesoamerican thing. There were rubber trees everywhere and a huge growth of rubber plantations, and rubber was the product of the time. It was being sent all over the world. People in Asia could now get rubber. People in Europe loved rubber.
Wow.
All because of canning. Okay.
Now,
Kurt, this Brazilian tree plantation, because rubber was so important, it was desired everywhere. Everyone wanted to get their Brazilian trees, their Brazilian rubber.
Everyone wants a little bit of that sweet, sweet Brazilian tree rubber. Come on.
I mean, what's not to love
Where
from
are they
Brazil?
hiding it? Get it out here. Check in the back. You got any more? Everything you got. We'll take the whole stock. Load up the car.
I want this room filled up to my head with rubber from Brazilian trees. So I think I got into your head just why rubber is incredible. At this point, people love rubber.
We're team
and
rubber.
Brazil is.
We're team rubber. Ready to lay down my life.
# team rubber. And rubber is now able to be sent up to Europe, and especially over the turn of the 1800s, now you're starting to see more vehicles and things such as tires being made and other artifacts made of rubber. Even now, things such as soccer balls or footballs, if you will. Now that the sport is developing, they're finally using rubber again to make these sports balls. So rubber really gets a huge increase in the mid 1800s because now people are fine traveling all the way to Brazil to get rubber and sending it all the way over to the world. Now, this keeps on going for the majority of history. And then we hit a very particular thing. We hit a very important event, an important event that you may have heard of called World War II.
Yes. Okay. Familiar.
World War II happens, and there is an incredible need for rubber.
Right.
So, they are lacking the rubber so much, Kurt.
Oh, no.
Seriously. They use rubber for everything, from uniforms to shoes, like combat boots, to helmets, to, like I mentioned, tires for their trucks, for tank treads. They're using rubber for a lot of things, even for different uses, like across the war, they're using rubber.
Yeah.
And for the majority of World War II, if we can recall, it was mostly a European war, right? Nothing really was fought in the Americas.
Right.
This means that there were a lot of blockades by the Germans to avoid European ships from leaving or American ships from entering.
Oh, no. They want the rubber for themselves? How could they do this?
Or maybe not for themselves, Kurt, but they don't want the rest of Europe or the Allies to get the rubber.
Wow.
So now,
that's cold. And they don't even care if they don't get it as long as no one gets the sweet, sweet rubber.
exactly. And because of this, Kurt, like you really can't have a lot of rubber, okay? Natural rubber is in short supply because you have to go all the way to Brazil, but now you can't go to Brazil because the Germans are stopping you.
Right.
It's wild, you know. Now, what are they trying to do? Like, the Germans actually took over Sri Lanka, so they are the only ones using the other important plantation of rubber. Okay, so the Allies really are lacking a lot of rubber.
Right.
They need rubber, the Allies do, for a very particular thing. And they're thinking, hey, we need to use as much of the rubber that we can. We need to mix it with another polymer or something else. We need to mix this rubber with something so that we can make it last for longer. But we don't know with what. And not only that, but we have flamethrowers that use latex, which is made of rubber, to make it a little bit sticky, right? Because you can't really use gasoline for your flamethrowers.
Right.
But we cannot use a lot of rubber. So we have to mix it with something else in order to make it last longer.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Get the most out of our rubber. What remaining we have.
The remaining rubber we have.
Somebody has not been recycling their rubber. I'll tell you that.
Exactly. Yes. So because of this, they needed to find something that could stick to targets better, that could burn for longer, because they need more rubber.
Right.
So when the U.S. entered the war, particularly the war in the Pacific, rubber was in short supply, and the U.S. government, as well as DuPont and Standard Oil, started a competition with different universities, including Harvard University, to develop a replacement for rubber.
Okay.
Something that they could use instead of latex, this natural latex.
Jello. My entry.
Jello.
Yeah, Jello. Try it. I mean, can't hurt. You never know.
It can't hurt. Well, that's what they did for years.
Jello?
Okay, Kurt. Maybe not Jello. But from 1942 to 1943, 44, around there were scientists from Harvard University, scientists from Standard Oil, from DuPont, that started mixing all these different materials with the short rubber or something, or using something that could be similar to rubber, so that they could use for bombs and flamethrowers and things of the sort. At this point, someone decided to mix rubber with gasoline, Kurt, with petroleum.
Okay.
And I don't know if you're familiar what happens when you mix rubber and petroleum, and also maybe add a little bit of palm oil.
No, what happens?
You get a little substance named napalm.
Ah, haha.
So, yeah, this organic compound created napalm, which was incredible for the uses that they needed. It basically makes gasoline into this sticky syrup that carries further and burns more slowly at higher temperatures, Kurt.
Interesting.
This really is devastating. Like this, they just made, like, compared to previous incendiary weapons, Kurt, napalm spreads further, sticks to the target, burns longer, and it's safer to dispense because it can be dropped off from faraway places like airplanes. It was also very cheap to manufacture. Okay.
Yeah, of course. Big game changer.
It's a big game changer. They essentially rediscovered Greek fire.
Right,
by trying by trying to mix all these compounds up. Like it won't go out by throwing water on it, which again, very dangerous.
Yeah.
And as we know, this caused a huge issue in the history of the world. This invention of napalm was very widely used in places like Vietnam.
Right.
And it caused terrible, terrible suffering for millions, thousands, if not millions of people, that to this day, there are survivors of Vietnam that have terrible burns because of the use of napalm. And it's even in 2001, there were some reports that napalm was being used in Afghanistan, although also other reports that napalm has been used in Iraq, and it's one of the most dangerous things in the world, Kurt. And it's the invention of napalm that unfortunately was brought upon because the French did not like the idea of canned foods.
If only they would have taken him at the French Shark Tank panel, this wouldn't have happened. Wow.
So because a man decided to put beets inside of a metal canister and warm it for 6 hours, Vietnam was warmed for more than 6 hours for some time. I'm so sorry, but can you believe like that seriously, it's one of those things where you don't really think of the repercussions that some
that's a
small
that's a
thing
wild connection.
like a small thing such as a patent law can impact the world in a really terrible place, Kurt.
Yeah, wow. And what year was it that they invented the napalm, or did they know right away that it was going to be a weapon, or was it like something that they invented and then it sat for a while?
Well, they invented it in 1944, Kurt, or 1943, around that time. And the use was to be used in war.
Right.
Like this was to be used as an extra sort of incendiary product. So they were always trying to develop something of the sort.
Right.
And it worked way better than they expected.
Yeah, wow. That's such an interesting connection. Why does it always lead to a weapon? By the way, why does every accidental invention somehow always lead to a major weapon?
Yeah, it's rough, but maybe as always, Kurt, it's always the French.
That's true. That's true.
You can always count on the French to potentially ruin world history.
On accident, too.
On accident, yeah. Unwillingly destroy the infrastructure of an entire country just by not liking canned food.
That is amazing. So, okay, Luis, I think it is time, perhaps, for our least favorite part of the podcast, which is...
I think so, Kurt. It's time for deliberation. All right, Kurt, you've just heard 2 stories today from me, all having to do about big dominoes and very, very small dominoes.
Yes. So give me the recap in little domino, big domino format.
Yes, Kurt. So first story you heard, or the story you've just now heard, small domino. The French patent law is stupid.
Was.
Yeah, it was.
Or maybe is. We don't know, I guess.
Big domino, the Vietnam War.
It has a lot of fire.
Right. Yes. The destruction of the Vietnamese landscape by napalm.
Yeah.
The first story you heard, Kurt, small domino, the Spanish don't know what dams are for. Big domino, Mexico does not succeed in global politics. So what do you think, Kurt?
Wow.
What are your thoughts on these 2 stories so far?
I think we got some high stakes on both these stories. It's got me like a little nervous too somehow, because somehow the stakes of how big the big dominoes are is making me really nervous about saying which one I don't think is real.
Yeah, potentially troubling.
So, all right. So for when you were telling me the first story, it seemed very, very heartfelt and like a story that's very important to you. And that could have just been because it was a story concerning Mexico, but it felt sincere in a way that made it seem very believable to me. I will say, okay, I heard this detail before that the Spanish wanted so much of the gold that they dredged the lake so that they could get any gold that might have been dropped. But it's totally possible that is like something that also happened, or that was a detail I was incorrectly told, or it's like, well, yeah, but actually it's kind of more because of this. So that doesn't really sway me either way, but I have kind of been thinking about that, because the other thing I have is that the connection of canned food to napalm with rubber trees in the middle is really, really weird. I mean, I think you're capable of thinking of it, but that is just pretty unexpected and also makes sense in a really real world way. So I right now I'm stuck between, I think that either you took a story about Mexico that it is true that the population migrated because something changed with the water, but the details in there have been changed, or I think that you strung together a whole bunch of inventions that were like lesser known, that changed human society, but are things that we don't really think about, and connected them. So I guess I'm weighing which one of those seems more likely for you to lie about.
Oh, damn. You're judging my ability, my intelligence, Kurt? Is that what I'm hearing?
This is for both of us, Luis, okay? I'm trying to break this streak of us getting fooled, all right? Somebody's got to do it. So I guess if I fall on the sword this time, it's going to be you next time. And speaking of falling on the sword, let me go ahead and get my soft spot ready here. I think that I am going to say that I think the story about Mexico is incorrect. I really want it to be true since I ranted so much about how people need to dispel with the viewpoint of why there's different societies. But I guess I'm landing on that I think the canned food to napalm connection is just a little too wild for you to have pulled out of thin air. Final answer.
Well, Kurt, if this assessment of my intelligence is correct for you, well, it is correct for me too. Congratulations, Kurt. That is indeed the real story.
Oh my gosh. That was murder, Luis. I didn't think you would lie to me about pivotal Mexican history.
It hurt. It hurt a little bit.
You are a sadistic person.
No, Kurt, I think the word you're looking for is heartless and traitorous.
When I said you are and something person, it was just so muscle memory for you that those words popped into your head.
Yeah, treason.
Okay. All right. Well, I got to get some answers. Tell me what happened then? Because it is true that Mexico City migrated from where it originally was, right? Or is it just that the water is gone?
The water disappeared in Mexico.
Right. In
Mexico City because of growing urbanization.
Ah, I see.
And flooding was a real issue, and the Spanish really had, they really didn't trust the natives to build dams that well. However, Kurt, that's never really been an issue other than some flooding sometimes. Whenever Mexico City floods to this day, it's pretty bad, but it's 4 months out of the year, Kurt. No, are you kidding me?
Right.
Suburbs didn't develop because rich people wanted to escape the flooding. The class system exists exclusively because of colonization, not because of outside forces. It's fully the Spanish fault and not nature. And the class system was and the growing pains of the country are real. And while it is real that Mexico has lost every single armed conflict it's been in, it's not because you can cut off the water so easily. It's because Mexico just doesn't have a great army. So
no, come on, Luis. There's still time. Come on, they can get one.
We're on the way, I guess. But yes, Mexico.
They just need one confidence booster war to win, and then they'll be up and going.
That's true. So yeah, no, that is a fake story. The water. It's true that the water disappeared, but everything else about migrations and everything else about the other cities growing strong because of water barons. Not a real thing.
Oh, no water barons either. No Mad Max in Mexico.
No Mad Max in Mexico. Dude. No. To this day, sure, Mexico City has some issues with water, but it's not huge problem right now. And the fun fact I invented, Kurt, about the term mojado, which means wet. Mm-hmm. Mojado does mean a person that illegally traveled to the United States, but that's its origin. It's people traveling to the United States.
Interesting.
Not to other places. There were never any sort of environmental refugees from within Mexico that went to other different places.
Wow, that was super convincing too. That seems super real.
Yeah, so that's what happened. Mexico does have water, and there are issues with water, but Mexico City does get its water from a big river, and it's never really been a problem. The rich just live in high places because of coincidence.
Just for funsies. So what I'm hearing is that all the depressing colonialism elements of the story are still there. It's just that most of the this is sad, but it's kind of funny too parts. Those are all gone. Is that what I'm?
Oh yeah.
To understand
whatever joy and lightheartedness in this story you found, Kurt, that's all fake.
Well, I think in the true Mexican spirit, that's the only thing left to do is pour tequila.
I guess so. Or maybe that's all we can do at this point, Kurt, because the truth would be way sad.
Yeah. So the other story then, all true. That is
just
really
completely
a wild connection.
It really is. It seriously, you never think that French patent law would lead to one of the most devastating inventions of the 20th century.
Well,
Seriously.
you know what the weird thing is that I guess in a way I would, because I said this like right at the end when I was making the guess, and I thought like this would be really confusing if someone was listening to this episode for the first time, where I was like, I think that's like a little too weird for you to have pulled out of thin air. Like, as weird as any story we can make, there will always be a story out there that you'll stumble on and be like, this is so weird. I never would have thought of this. And of course it ends up being napalm, some devastating weapon that we started with some like boring canned food. And this is going to make our trade way more easy. So now we can get rubber. Like, you know, history has just got this beautiful way of all the stories have similar themes and patterns in a way that somehow you can recognize when you see it, but you can never predict. You know, it makes sense when you're like, yeah, of course, French, or like, no, and then it became napalm in the end. But I never would have thought to put those things together.
And you know, like we've said before, it's often these cause and effects that we don't expect that are the most human stories. You know. Like it really is these where you absolutely don't expect it, where it comes from nowhere. Surprisingly, those are always the real stories.
Also, out of interest, one of the calculations I was kind of frantically trying to do in my head at the end was, okay, so you said that they invented napalm in 1944?
Yeah, around that area.
Because I was thinking was napalm used in the Pacific Theater? Because I know that I don't think they were following the Geneva Conventions in the Pacific Theater. And then I was trying to think, before Vietnam, would it have come up? The Korean War, I think, was before the Vietnam War, but they would have been following the Geneva Conventions, which means you can't use napalm. I was trying to do all this in my head when you were telling me the end of the story. I don't know if I seemed a little distracted, but I was like, man, where's a U.S. history class when you need it?
Seriously. So
it's the worst U.S. history topic to try to be remembering. I'm like, what is all the time the U.S. has used like really brutal weapons on a foreign power? Like all the things they're not going to teach me in school.
you know how you're not going to find out if it was used. Why we have not heard about napalm use in World War II, Kurt? Because they still didn't know it was that bad.
Yeah.
You know, once it's apparent that this is not a good situation.
Yeah.
That's when it gets. They're like Americans are typically like, how long can I use this absolutely awful, destructive crime against humanity until I'm found out?
Yeah. So was there napalm used in World War II then?
Briefly, I actually am not sure, but considering this was built and invented for World War II, I would imagine so.
Interesting. Huh. I don't know if I knew that.
So there we go. Now we know a little something more how humans are awful always.
That's true. Well, is that news? Is that news? Do we not know that? What were we saying earlier? History like kind of sucks mostly.
Yeah. You know, it's not news, Kurt, but I think it's something important that we should just recall once in a while.
That's true. Everybody just keep that in mind.
Keep us humble.
What does that bring our score to now, Luis?
I believe we are once again tied, Kurt.
Once again tied. Hoo-hoo. And are you breathing a sigh of relief that I broke our streak of us getting fooled? Because that felt like dangerously like a curse was sneaking up on us or something, at least to me.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And with that, well, like always, thank you for listening to these two stories that we come prepared to every single episode. Let us know what you think. Did you think napalm was invented by the French accidentally? Or did you trust me when I said that the Spanish suck? Please let us know. You can find us on our social media accounts. On Twitter, we are at UnbelievablePC. And on Instagram, we are at UnbelievablePod. Get in contact with us if you'd like. You can find us anywhere. Leave us a review if you'd like. And if you don't, do whatever you want. Thank you once again for listening.
Yes. And remember, put all your personal possessions and houses on flotation devices just in case. You never know.
All hands and feet inside the floating house.